Hey everybody, today we are going to learn how to present our models for upcoming projects. The techniques we're going to learn today are going to be focusing on Mental Ray. And Mental Ray is a little bit different than Maya's standard software renderer. We're going to be using a technique called Final Gather Rendering. Final Gather Rendering will kind of act like a dome or an environment or sky that will light our model here in front of us. Alright, so let's get started. So what you can see is I have this model of a PlayStation. It looks like a PS4 here. And I'm going to use this PS4 and I'm going to model, or excuse me, I'm going to render it so that you can get the best view. Now, we're not going to really deal with lighting or shadows yet for these models. And I'm going to show you why here. By default, Maya is set to Maya Software Renderer. Now, Maya Software Renderer, though a really nice, powerful tool, is not strong enough for what we want and the display and the final quality that we want here in our render. So if I were to go to Maya Software and I would go to the Maya Software tab and raise this to highest quality or production quality and do a quick render, I get a nice object. It's not exactly the most realistic looking object that I have ever created, but we want to make it look like it's actually in the real world. And to start doing that, we're going to do a Final Gather render. Now, for many of you, you may have heard this referred to as a clay modeling rendering, mainly because it looks like it was made out of clay or somebody sculpted this this PlayStation here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to activate Mental Ray. And to activate Mental Ray, some of you may already have it turned on, but for those of you who don't, please go to Window, Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager. Go ahead and click on Plugin Manager. Now this can be a little overwhelming for the first time user. There's a lot of stuff to check. A friendly tip of advice is do not touch any of this. Simply scroll down, and yours may look like this when you first open. Go down here to Mental Ray and make sure it's loaded, and I would go ahead and make sure it's auto-loaded. Once that happens, you simply hit close, and Mental Ray will be turned on. Now, if I go and render again, it's still going to be in the Maya Software tab. So I have to physically turn it on in our render settings or our render globals. So let's go up to render settings. We'll move this over here so we can kind of see what we're working with. And we'll go back to the Common tab, and we want to render using Maya Mental Ray. And that's the very last one. Now, if you didn't do the step I just previously did, you will not see Mental Ray here. It just will not appear. So that is the way to get it to show up. So I'm going to go to Mental Ray, and I have a lot of options, and they're a little overwhelming, so we're going to go step by step through this. Now, being that we are only going to render a single image, we're going to skip over some of these other elements. In the Common tab, let's for instance say I was rendering more than one image, like maybe 1,000 images in a row. I would change the frame number and extension, I would put a file name down, and eventually would use that to bring it into my editing program of my choice. Well, all I really need to worry about right now is the resolution. Now, for our class sake, I want you guys to render at least HD, and I prefer to be HD 1080. Now, for demo's sake, I'm going to keep this very low because Mental Ray tends to be very expensive when it comes to render times. Now, what do I mean by expensive? Well, I mean that it takes a lot more seconds and minutes to render in Mental Ray to get that realistic look than perhaps it would take in Maya Software. Now, I'm going to keep my height and width for now, for demo's sake, at 640 by 480, and I'm going to make sure my resolution stays at 72, mainly because in our case, we're rendering for the computer screen, so we do not need to go any higher than that. One of the next things I need to do is open the Render Options tab at the very bottom, and I'm going to scroll down, and I want to turn off Enable Default Light, so uncheck that setting. I've done everything I need to. Now, if we did a quick render right now, I'm going to go ahead and just keep this, I'm going to just close this up real quick and render the current frame. You're going to find that nothing appears. Well, the first inclination you may have is, okay, we need to put a light in it because we enabled the lighting. Well, what I want to happen is I want to use this background color right here. You see like the background of the sky or the rest of our scene. I want to use that to illuminate my scene. And that's using a technique called Final Gather. Final Gather almost takes the elements and the rays of light from color or another object and projects them as atmosphere onto the actual image. So what I'm going to do is, now that I've enabled default light, I turned that off, I'm going to go and I'm going to go to the Features tab, and I want to turn on the Final Gather feature, or Final Gathering feature. I'm going to check that. Then I'm going to go to Quality. Now for quality, you're pretty good. You don't have to play with this too much. Some people will play with the samples. If you understand samples, you'd understand that. If not, just leave it default. Then finally, Indirect Lighting. And you can see my Final Gathering is already checked, per that I checked it in the Features tab. And I'm going to go ahead and raise my numbers. So what is all these things? So Final Gather accuracy is basically the number of rays per Final Gather point cast into the hemisphere. So imagine it acting such as a light. The point density is the number of Final Gather points, so the higher the number the better. I'm going to move it up to 5 for now. And then the point interpolation is to be considered the shading sample for the rendering. The higher values, the smoother your rendering. So if you have blemishes or dots, the point density and the point interpolation, as well as the accuracy, will help. The higher these numbers go, the more expensive your rendering is. Now there are other things as well. For instance, let me hop down here, filter quality and whatnot. We're going to play with these a little later in another lesson when we learn how to actually incorporate color into our lighting. Alright, now that we have that, we have one more step to do. I want you to go and navigate to your current camera that you're looking through. Now, firstly, I have a couple of things to do. So up at the top, I'm going to select my current camera, and yours is going to look something like this, and I'm going to scroll down in my attribute editor until I see environment. Yours most likely will be black. I want you to turn that environment up. You can even set an environment color, but I would keep it gray for now, and I want it to be roughly about 25% gray. Now, I'm going to, on the same bar, I'm going to keep moving over until I see this blue ball called the resolution gate. And this is going to give me a nice dynamic viewport to kind of look through and kind of set up my composition. So that looks about right now. Some other things that Mental Ray will do automatically is turn on something called ray tracing. Ray tracing needs to be on to get this now dome cast of this light gray dome, which you'll see in a second, to cast shadows with your object and give it that clay feel. Now, if you've done all that, and again, the environment is a very important factor. This is kind of like your dimmer switch for your lighting. Imagine a big dome of light around here. Watch what happens now when I render. So we'll give it a few seconds here. Again, it is an expensive render, so it will take some time. But what you'll notice is you'll get a lot more realistic shaded and shadowed render than you normally would with your standard Maya software renderer. Give it a few seconds and voila, you have yourself a really nice render. Now, there's some changes we can make. For instance, I tend to use my render region function here. If I want to cancel one, I just simply hit escape. But if I want to play with settings, I drag a box over and I can kind of up the value, hit the render box. You can see it brightened it up slightly. Also, what I can do is go into my render globals, which can be found in a variety of places, and I can up maybe my point value or my final gather rays. I can put that up maybe to 700. Put these point values up. They're pretty good at 5. We could go higher just to show you how long it will take, but we'll hit close here. We'll render this. And the more we play with this, you can see the denser the render is. Those boxes were not that dense last time I rendered. So it's refining the light and tightening up some of the light that was a little broader in the areas. So when we're said and done, now that only took 17 seconds, but mind you, I'm rendering not nearly as big as you would for your project. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and set it to HD, and kind of to end here, I'll show you how much render time this actually takes. Now the resolution is obviously a little different because of the change in pixels. So I'm going to readjust my camera. I'm going to hit render, and we have our settings really high right now, and you can see it's going to take quite a bit of time to render this out. And we're going to just kind of wait through it. This is something that every CG artist has to do. It's kind of like watching paint dry. But in the end, you'll have a really sharp result. And this is essentially the last step you would take to render your models to show off the modeling phase. So pretty nice. Let it run through. You want to be mindful of of course, your ray trace, which we'll learn a little bit more down the road about. And eventually what we're going to learn is how to run a environment dome. So we're going to take a picture or image and use that image to actually light the scene and cause reflections and refractions and all sorts of different unique types of effects. So you can see this one is a lot longer and does take some time to kind of come through for you. This will probably take roughly anywhere between 3 to 4 minutes to render this, and that is not uncommon. Now, when you guys get into the texturing phase and you apply materials, such as Maya Mental Ray materials or other shiny reflective materials, your render times will drastically increase and become more expensive. What you've seen that I've done here is I've only simply used 2 default Maya Lambert shaders. So that's default gray. That's all I want you guys to do. I don't need any color. I don't need anything like that. This is just basically looking for errors in my model, understanding the basic shape and proportion and elements such as that. So what we're doing is we're kind of rendering through, and we're about halfway done, and we're probably at the 2 to 3 minute mark already. So this may take a little longer. But this is very important that you guys understand, because by the end of the semester, your render may press 45 minutes to an hour depending on your computer speed. Now, the best thing to do with a render is not run any other programs in the background. You can see I have Firefox up. I probably should have closed that. But I don't have any other thing running. So Photoshop and Illustrator and After Effects, those are all very RAM and memory intensive programs. Turn those off when you're rendering. It will save you some render time. And this is a really good tip because, again, when you add in lights, other shadows, and other objects, and reflections and refractions come into play, which we'll learn about down the road, it becomes a very expensive process for you and a time-consuming process for you as well. You want to make sure that you have your model pretty set before you go and up the resolution and pixel value like I've done just now. If my model wasn't completely done, I would probably do test renders at 640 by 480 or even 320 by 240 just to get the overall composition and the angle set. Because one of the last things you want to do is spend all this time waiting and then realize that you had the angle of the render all wrong. Go through, we're almost done here. It's kind of calculating its final pass. And you can see once it clears up, and it will kind of just start. You'll see some of these lines start refining a little bit. Let's go one by one, zoom in. And the reason I do one by one is to see the overall feel to it. And I'll pan just like I do in Maya. That's a pretty decent render. I got a little bit of pixelization I could play with. And there's a little bit over here of anti-aliasing, but overall, I'm pretty happy with that. And I would basically do a file, save image. Or I could even right-click on this file and do a file, save image. Once I'm in the save image category, I could save a raw image. That's great. I could go down here and save a JPEG, a PNG, a TIFF, you name it. You'll find it down here and will be great. It's kind of funny. There is actually a Sony PlayStation format. If you modeled a PlayStation, that do not use that. That is not for what you think it is for. But it's just kind of ironic because I have a PlayStation. All right. Hopefully you guys learned some rendering techniques and final gathering techniques. Your best bet is to experiment with a lower resolution and continue to work up to what you envision to have, which is a realistic model. All right, guys. Catch you next time.